Steve Kaufman is wrong about vocabulary in language learning. In fact, learning vocabulary through comprehensible input alone is a terrible idea. It's going to massively slow you down, and it will take forever for you to understand the language. And when it comes to speaking it, it's even worse. You're going to be watching videos and reading and listening to the language for years and years and thousands of hours, and you will never become fluent. Don't get me wrong, I like Steve Kaufman. He's done a lot for the language learning community. His link app is actually quite good for input, and input is important for language learning. Both input and output are important, and link is one of the best resources for input, and it's actually really good for output as well if you use it right, something that most people don't. But the reality of it is, the advice Steve himself gives is often pretty bad because it mostly focuses on one thing. The solution to everything is more input, more reading, more videos, more listening to the language. And all of that does help, but it's extremely slow when it comes to learning vocabulary. And it's also not a good way by itself if you just do that to learn to speak. You need input and output. And you also need to work on your vocab. Otherwise, input won't be comprehensible. For comprehensible input to work, you need to make it comprehensible by learning the words first. The reason I'm making this video is because people keep asking me about it. Apparently, Steve is making video after video telling you all not to learn vocabulary, just to read and listen more and to watch more videos in the language, and eventually vocabulary will come and also your speaking skills will improve eventually, at some point. And the reality of it is that it doesn't work like that. And if people ask me, I will give my honest opinion. But first of all, let me make one thing clear. I agree with Steve Kaufman on a lot of things. One of them is that you should jump to interesting but difficult content as soon as possible. I've heard him say that, and I fully agree. If you keep watching beginner videos, Spanish with Fernando, whatever, more beginner videos, let's go back to the basics, let's learn the basic vocab and the basic grammar, and again and again and again, you go over the basics until you feel confident enough to actually start using native content, authentic content, by native speakers, for native speakers. You will never do it. You will stay stuck with the beginner materials forever. I know a lot of people like this. They've been watching or listening to the same tired, boring, dumbed down language learning YouTube channels over and over again for years. And they still can't understand native speaker content, and they can't speak the language well. So yes, I agree with Steve Kaufman that you should jump to interesting content as soon as possible, even if it's difficult. That said, there's a huge problem with his advice. If you jump from beginner materials to podcasts or YouTube videos or books in the native language about topics you're interested in, history, sports, whatever, you're going to face a massive amount of vocabulary that you don't understand. And you can learn through inputs. You can start watching and reading and looking up all the words that you don't know. But that's going to massively slow you down. And you're going to have to constantly stop and look up words. And it's going to be very hard to enjoy any kind of content if every other word you have to stop and look that word up. It's also not very efficient because there are lots and lots of words that you don't know in those materials. And you have to look them up again and again. And because those words are low frequency words, they will not show up again for a while, long enough for you to forget them. So you will keep seeing them every once in a while and you'll keep forgetting them before next time. That's the problem with low frequency words. There's a lot of them, so you'll constantly face a lot of unknown words, but most of them will be low frequency, so you'll forget them before next time you see them. That's the problem with low frequency words. There's also the fact that if you are really interested in one niche, you will encounter a lot of vocabulary that's specific from that niche. Specialized vocabulary. And those words, you learn them very quickly because they show up all the time, or regularly at least, in that specific niche, when you're reading or listening to content from that specific niche. But there will also be a lot of words, mostly verbs, adverbs, and adjectives, that are lower frequency but are not niche specific, that will slow you down a lot. Because you will keep seeing them often enough for them to be a problem for your comprehension, but not often enough for you to remember them next time. There's a lot of those, and they will be a problem unless you learn them deliberately. So with Steve Kaufman's advice, you will keep watching or reading or listening to interesting but difficult content for years, and you will understand it if you read it really slowly and you look up all the words, but you will not learn vocabulary fast with it, and it will continue being hard for years. Is this better than staying stuck with beginner materials and Spanish with Juan? Yes, absolutely. But it's still very slow and inefficient. So what's the solution? Very simple. Learn vocabulary deliberately. Use mnemonics to memorize vocabulary fast, hundreds of words, and then use example sentences to review that vocabulary in massive amounts of reviewing, lots of sentences, thousands and thousands of words, mostly verbs, adjectives, and nouns, with example sentences and audio. And you review those example sentences over and over again, after memorizing them with mnemonics. And this way, you can learn all the vocabulary that you need relatively fast. And this is not the most fun thing to do, but if you do this early on and frequently, the actually interesting content, the native speaker content about topics you're interested in, will get much easier to understand very quickly. And if you keep doing this, you can combine both, and you can do more and more of the interesting input, because it will get easier and easier to understand, and less of the deliberate learning. I highly recommend you front load all the deliberate learning of vocabulary, including advanced vocabulary, from the very beginning, so that the actually interesting input becomes comprehensible as soon as possible, and then you get to enjoy the language. It really doesn't matter if your goal is to just enjoy shows in the language or read books in the language, or you actually want to become fluent as well. You are going to have to learn a lot of vocabulary. And the faster you learn vocab, the sooner native speaker content will become comprehensible, so you get to enjoy it, and also your speaking will get better. Deliberate, targeted, and effective learning of vocabulary plus input is 10 times more effective than just input. Let's say two people start learning Spanish at the same time. Person A goes to YouTube, finds Spanish with Fernando, and watches 3 hours a day of comprehensible input beginner materials with it, video after video. Person B takes the lists of the most common verbs, adjectives, and nouns in Spanish with example sentences and audio files, memorizes all those words with mnemonic associations, and reads and listens to the example sentence list over and over again. Person B also writes down everything he wants to be able to say in the language, every single sentence for every situation, translates it into Spanish, creates audio files, and reviews those as well over and over again. So both people get approximately the same amount of learning time, mostly via input, but person B also uses a lot of mnemonic associations. After 1 month of learning, 30 days, who do you think will understand more? Who do you think will speak better? And if you're not 100% sure that it's going to be person B, by far, person B is going to sound 10 times better in Spanish and understand way more as well. If you're not 100% sure that person B is going to be way better at Spanish, you have no idea what you're talking about. Input is mostly effective to review what you've already learned. You need to learn vocabulary deliberately. I highly recommend you focus on verbs, adjectives, and nouns. You could also take Paul Nation's frequency lists with the most common 1,000 word families, the most common 2,000 word families, etc. Create example sentences for those and learn those in order. You can do all the input you want. But focus on learning vocabulary first, because otherwise input is going to be extremely slow and ineffective. Like I said, the only reason I'm making this video is because people ask me to do it. Because people like Steve Kaufman keep making video after video about comprehensible input and reading and watching videos being the only thing that you need to do in order to learn a language. And that's a bunch of misinformation that's costing you a lot of time and results. That kind of advice is making you waste a lot of your time. And time is valuable. Now, earlier I talked about mnemonic associations as the fastest way to memorize vocabulary. If you don't know what this is, you should check the link in the description. I just uploaded a tutorial with lots of examples on how to do this. It's a game changer. If you learn to use this technique effectively, you can learn thousands of words really quickly. And once you're able to do that, input will actually be comprehensible relatively early on, and you'll get to enjoy it.